It's 1918. World War I is over, and nations across Europe and Asia lie in ruins. Revolution is sweeping through Europe, removing monarchies that have been in power, in some cases, for centuries. As societies look to rebuild, the Italian journalist Benito Mussolini, formerly a socialist, writes a radical political manifesto suggesting an entirely new form of government. His authoritarian regime will be ruled by a single supreme leader. Individual rights will be stripped for the good of the greater society. His far-right militant state would restore a nationalistic greatness. It's an idea he calls fascism. 10 years later, another World War I veteran, Adolf Hitler, comes to power at the head of his own form of fascism, what he calls National Socialism, or Nazism. Together, these two men set into motion the largest conflict in human history, attempting to create a global fascist world order. We know today how this story ends. Millions of innocent people will die, caught in the crossfire of fascist rule during World War II. But one part of this story is largely forgotten. We forget that fascism had countless followers right here in the United States. And even today, there are people who want to keep the flame of fascism alive. My name is Bradley W. Hart. I'm the author of the award-winning book, Hitler's American Friends, the Third Reich Supporters in the United States. This is the Star-Spangled Fascism Podcast.
It was exciting. I mean, fascism...
It's crazy. It's almost like they didn't want you to learn this stuff in school and instead taught you to square dance. I wonder why. Could it be that they wanted to perhaps repeat history and that's why they didn't want you to learn it? And that's why you didn't learn about things like the business plot, for example? Or the Battle of Blair Mountain?
Was seen as the wave of the future, was seen as the modernizing path that would get us to happy economic days ahead.
The term fascism gets thrown around a lot these days. Most often it's meant as a form of political insult. But that wasn't always the case. During the 1920s and 1930s, there were Americans who openly identified themselves as fascist, or embraced fascist ideologies, or hoped to inspire nationwide movements.
Last 3 out of 14 undersea cables in the Red Sea, the Yemen Houthis. Oh, really? I'm gonna have to look into that. I haven't heard anything about that, probably because I was getting ready to stream. Gottfried actually did learn some of this in school. Oh, wow, that's amazing that he actually learned some of this in school. Funny enough, actually, we learned a lot about the Holocaust because we had a teacher named Mrs. Petska. Now, I'm not sure if she was a survivor, her family were survivors, but we had to do an entire, almost like half a semester on studying it, learning about the camps, learning about how it all came to be. And then we had two survivors come in and talk to us, but unfortunately, their accent was so deep that all of us hayseed Ohio kids had a bit of trouble understanding, but just to be able to look at some of the memorial items that they brought with them. So I imagine if they tried doing that these days, it would just be called woke. And then some teacher would get fired and that kind of thing.
Right here in the US. And alongside my own research on these characters, one individual has recently stepped up to become an authority on the rise of fascism in America. My very special guest on the first episode of Star-Spangled Fascism is the one and only Rachel Maddow, host of The Rachel Maddow Show, airing Mondays at 9 p.m. on MSNBC. In 2022, Rachel did the absolutely fantastic podcast series Ultra that I was lucky enough and privileged enough to take part in. Thank you again for that, Rachel.
Absolutely.
2023, you published the best-selling book, Prequel, which has done a number of weeks on the bestseller chart, a book that I learned a lot from, even as a historian. So first off, congratulations congratulations on all the success with this material, Rachel. I think one thing that I reflect on a lot as a historian is that the 1930s is a really difficult time in American history. I mean, 1933 is really the depths of the Great Depression. Unemployment hits nearly 25% in the first year that Franklin Roosevelt is in office, and in fact caps 25% in some parts of the country. This is a period where a lot of Americans desperately need economic relief, but it's simply not coming. And at the same time, we have the rise of fascism in Europe. The Soviet Union, of course, has been around for a while at this point. But I think you and I have both been intrigued by Americans who sort of fall in to sympathizing or being involved with fascism in some way. I guess the question that I think about a lot, and I suspect you might too, is what is the appeal of fascism for at least some Americans in the 1930s?
Well, first of all, Bradley, let me just say this is so exciting that you're doing this podcast. I'm really, really, really looking forward to hearing all of it, and I can't wait.
Before she gives her summation, I'm going to say it's a combination of nationalism, religion, and grievance politics. Let's see what she says, but if I had to boil it down to those three, it'd be it.
To see how you develop this, and I'm honored to be here. On that first question, I think that I sort of look at it from two directions. One is that there was obviously an international wind blowing at that time, whether it was generated by the worldwide depression or whether it was happening as a sort of, as a political tide that was cresting for other reasons. We had, Mussolini in Italy, and we had Franco in Spain, and we had Hitler in Germany, and all of those winds that were driving countries toward autocracy and specifically toward fascism were blowing here too. While fascism is nationalistic, I don't think there's any one particular nation or one type of nation that is more prone to it than others. And so I think that Americans were susceptible to the allure of fascism for all the reasons that people were susceptible to it in other countries. I think that the harder thing for us to sort of sit with as Americans is that there have been fascistic tendencies, fascistic movements in America and in American power for longer than we like to admit. I think that there's really good arguments to make about the Klan having been a fascistic movement in the days before fascism, even as a word, was coined. And I think that the allure of authoritarianism, the idea of anti-democratic, authoritarian, nationalist, race-based nationalist rule, is something that different American groups and demagogues have played with for a long time. Americans in significant numbers have liked these ideas for a long time and in recurrent cycles in our history.
I think what you just...
The funny thing was how many Americans actually had to be convinced eventually that Hitler was bad and they needed to go fight him through things like Disney cartoons, because like I'll have to do a reaction to an old World War II piece of, I suppose, for lack of a better word, propaganda that was anti-Nazi, because there were so many people who were convinced that fascism was the way to go. And then they go and they fight Nazis and they see how horrible they were. And when they come back to America, it's like, no. We never wanted any of that. We just want states' rights. Yeah. And so I think they held on to the same beliefs, but because it was just so uncool and unacceptable to have any sort of fascist sympathies, especially after, how many of people's relatives dying fighting fascism, that everybody just kind of put it back under the rock. And then, fucking in the 70s, that tried to rear its ugly head again, and that got beat back. Thank you, Blues Brothers. I think that movie is one of the reasons, because it lampooned Nazis. It made that and like Blazing Saddles and stuff. It made it society know that being racist is stupid. And then Trump came along, and now we're back in this loop. It's been 20 years since. Oh, yeah, perhaps that teacher is long past. My children didn't get the same education. Yeah, Derek, there's so many things that's been changed from the school curriculum from when we were kids because we don't want to hurt Meemaw's feelings, now do we?
Just said it is really fascinating in the sense that we have to remember that fascism was a brand new ideology in a lot of ways in the 1920s and 30s. You know, this was Mussolini only takes power in late 1922, and he in a lot of ways originates fascism as an ideology. Hitler himself only takes power in January of 1933, and of course people at the time don't really know how this is going to play out. You know, millions of people haven't yet died in World War II, and so there is something of, you know, people not knowing how the story is going to end in that sense that can give fascism, I think, some kind of an allure.
Yeah, and it also seems it's a new word. Fascism is a new word. It's a new concept, and it's these movements of led by relatively young leaders. It's old countries with young leaders leading often youth-driven mass movements, and people looking at that from the outside, and especially in a country that's fallen on hard times or that's where people are susceptible to arguments that their system of government is not up to the task. They look at those things and it was exciting. I mean, fascism was seen as the wave of the future, was seen as the modernizing path that would get us to happy economic days ahead, and a sense of community and a sense of nationhood and all of those things. It was, let's pursue fascism here because it's the way that we're going to improve things for all Americans.
Absolutely. I mean, very much this idea that I've found throughout a lot of the characters I've looked at, that this is an ideology that's supposed to sort of bring back a sense of past greatness. But, I think that the cast of characters you talk about in Ultra and Prequel is really fascinating. And I've looked into a few of these characters.
Fascism and conservatives being obsessed with the past is another thing that always helps with demagogues. They know if they can always appeal to people's past. Things were just better back then. I mean, think about it. How many people have you ever heard of paying ridiculous amounts of money for some childhood nostalgia thing just because it brings them back to that nostalgia? Think about like Rosewood. Rosebud. Sorry, Rosebud. That's for any Citizen Kane fans out there.
Characters as well. But I want to ask you just about a few of these figures that may not be widely remembered by people today. Mm-hmm. A lot of these characters have kind of fallen into the dustbin of history, reputationally or just in terms of us remembering them at all. Lawrence Dennis being one of these characters. I mean, Lawrence Dennis, to me, a fascinating figure, seen as kind of the intellectual godfather in some ways of fascism in the United States. You talk about him quite a bit in your book. Why is Lawrence Dennis such an important figure, and why do you think people just don't remember who this guy was at all today?
Lawrence Dennis is a fascinating figure for a million reasons, for a million political reasons and also personal reasons. Let's start with some of the personal stuff first, I think, just because you got to get it. You got to give people a sense of who he was as a man. Lawrence Dennis actually spent a good part of his very young life as an internationally renowned traveling child preacher. He was born to a father who was listed in his birth certificate as mixed race, and a mother who was listed in records as black, as African American. He himself was light-skinned as a young man, as a kid. He identified as African American and traveled the world as this miraculous black preacher, child preacher. Once he was of sort of boarding school age, he decided he would pass as white, and then for almost until the end of his life passed as white, and it would come as very shocking news to people who followed him in the fascist movements that he was part of starting in the 1930s to know that he was not white himself. He had been a State Department employee. He worked in Wall Street. He was an economist. He was incredibly intelligent. He had a personality that caused lots of people to want to become acolytes of his. People followed him like apostles. People also fell in love with him. Men and women of all different strata fell in love with him. A lot of famous people allowed Lawrence Dennis to become their ghostwriter. So he just loomed very large. He was sort of the brain of the fascist movement. And he wrote The Coming American Fascism, which is the closest thing that I think American intellectual history has to a Bible of fascism as an American possibility for a new form of government here.
And I think one thing that really fascinates me about Dennis is that personal dynamism that you're talking about. I mean, this is a man who kind of lived off the cuff for most of his life, it seems like, befriended a lot of very powerful and influential people, sort of made money off of newsletters and public speeches and things of this sort, but didn't seem to really hold down much of a traditional job in that sense. And this, I think, is one thing I've noticed about a lot of these leaders in the U.S. is that they aren't really they're very dynamic, number one, which is something that's true of Hitler and Mussolini, but they really have these non-traditional careers. And another example of this, of course, is William Dudley Pelley, another man who sort of is this larger-than-life figure. He's a former Hollywood screenwriter turned fascist leader. And one thing that I've been thinking about recently is that this group that he founds, the Silver Legion, that you talk about in Chapter 7 of a prequel, really resembles in some ways Christian nationalism in the way that it is being sort of politically defined somewhat in our own time. What was your read on William Dudley Pelley, someone we're going to talk about extensively in the podcast series here? And I think in some ways he might even have a longer staying power than someone like a Dennis in terms of relevance to our own time today.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. It's also, when you think about Dennis and Pelley as two characters, thinking about them as a kind of a pair, the way that you're positing it, to think about money and how it is that they made a living. I mean, one of the ways that Lawrence Dennis was able to make a living as a essentially fascist public intellectual is that the Nazis were paying him. The German government in Berlin was...
I was muted when I said it earlier, but holy shit, it's the 1930s Jordan Peterson.
funneling money to him for various publications and newsletters, including through, their agents in the United States. Like, well, that helped. With Pelley, on the other hand, the way that he made his money was off of a sort of quasi-spiritualist, occult grift, where he told people that he had died or somehow otherwise visited the afterlife, that he basically was an antenna tuned directly into messages from God, and these weren't just voices in his head. One of the things that God did, according to Pelley, was that he dictated books to William Dudley Pelley, and Pelley didn't even understand what he was writing down, but it was dictated to him by God, and he would write these books, and then you, for a very reasonable fee, could buy these books from William Dudley Pelley. You could go to his sham.
A fool and their money are parted once more. I swear to God, if you just say it with enough conviction, you can get the rubes to believe anything. Especially if you put it in a cloak of anything supernatural, whether it's religion or the occult. P.T. Barnum said it. One born every day.
University and take an entire curriculum of things dictated.
Oh yeah, Godfrey. Totally, Joseph Smith ran the same scam with the magic hat. I got these visions. No one was around when I got them. But by God, I got them. Dum 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 dum.
To William Dudley Pelley by the Great Spirit. And so there's a ridiculous factor and a grifter scam factor to William Dudley Pelley. Also, the fact that his Silver Legion had a dumb looking uniform and everybody wore uniforms, that also gives him sort of a weirdo factor. All of those things are alienating, I think, in terms of trying to take him seriously as a public figure. But then you look at the influence of the Silver Legion. It's thousands of followers, tens of thousands, perhaps, something close to like 100,000 sympathizers and people who are hangers-on of that movement, while he's telling them to, stockpile guns and ammunition, and they are. And they're training for a Christian nationalist violent overthrow of the U.S. government in conjunction with other armed fascist and pro-German groups. And the idea is to cleanse the world, cleanse America of non-Christians, specifically of Jews, and to institute a Führer system under Pelley. And it sounds bananas, but it's amazing the number of people that he persuaded to his plan. And the publications are insane. They still circulate on the right today. I mean, on the far right today, both Lawrence Dennis and William Dudley Pelley are still widely read and still circulating. It's just sort of in Normieville that they've descended to obscurity.
Of course.
Well, and Pelley has this interesting involvement with sort of the early UFO movement as well later on. I mean, some of the automatic writing that he's talking about, which is this idea of, dictating things from spirits, and you're holding someone's hand and sort of writing these things down. I mean, those books, as you say, read really bonkers to us, but in some ways they feed into the emergence of sort of the UFO movement in the 1950s.
And that stuff was really fashionable at the time,
Very, very fashionable. And I've heard that there are recordings of him actually doing seances. I have not yet tracked any of those down.
Oh, please call me if you find them. Please.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think religion is a big part of this, obviously. I mean, the idea of Christianity being intermixed with sort of Pelley's strange ideas about politics. This is something we see across a number of these figures. And the big media figure, of course, who uses this is Father Charles Coughlin, who I argue in my book is probably the most successful radio host in American history.
A portion of my family on my mother's side attended his rallies in Cleveland, Ohio. I was raised in Christian nationalism, so I know all about this mess. Exactly. Mike Flynn is the modern Charles Coughlin.
A man who did an audience upward probably of 25 million people in a country about half the size of what it is today. I mean, this would be enormous ratings, as we would put it now. And you talk a lot about Coughlin and his Christian Front movement, as it's called, or a Christian Front movement associated with him. In chapter 13 of your book, from a sort of media history perspective, how should we think about Coughlin and the movement that he really inspires in this period?
Coughlin, I think you are completely right, cannot be underestimated in terms of his influence, the historic size of his audience and his reach. And when you combine that with his radicalism, with what he was preaching by the time you get to the late 30s, by the time you get to 1938, there just isn't any other thing like it. I mean, Bradley, I know you know that when you write about this era and you write about fascism in America, a lot of people want to find modern doppelgangers for these historical figures.
Yeah.
There's no modern doppelganger for Charles Coughlin. And I don't think that we ever will have somebody that powerful with that much of a reach again. But Coughlin was overtly preaching.
Yeah, actually, she does make a point, because if you look at the volume, the actual audience that Coughlin had, it's just astounding. In fact, they modeled Brother Justin from Carnival off of Charles Coughlin. Did you know that?
Fascism, he used the word. He said that he would talk about needing bullets when the ballot box failed. He talked about the Franco way meaning a military dictatorship as the way that American democracy would end, and would instead have have a dictator. He organized his followers into platoon-style militia groups, one of which was put on trial for sedition for an alleged plot to murder multiple congressmen and set off a series of politically sensitive bombings and killings that would start a state of emergency and ultimately result in the military takeover, a paramilitary takeover of the government, first in New York.
From everything that I'm seeing and reading, that seems to be MAGA's plan if Trump loses, is for them just to throw the biggest hissy fit possible, and then they're going to get their ass clapped by the government because, the whole enemies, foreign and domestic thing, and then they're going to play victim. But the most important thing is that us, anti-fascists, make sure that when they try to play victim, you just remind them, no, this was your fault. So, it's going to be a very interesting election year.
New York and then in Washington. I mean, it was really, really radical what he was preaching and what he was asking his followers to do. And it was very theologically informed. Charles Gallagher's book, Nazis in Copley Square, does a great...
That is a fantastic book. If you've never read it, I definitely recommend it if you're interested in this subject. What up, Tony TB? Yes, the audience is split among a bunch of hate preachers like Greg Locke now. It's a difficult name, Greg Locke. Did you see that a bunch of snow fell on his church and collapsed it? Where's your God now?
Great job. Charles Gallagher is an eminent historian and also a Jesuit priest himself. And he does a really good job talking about how the theology of the Coghlan movement and the Christian Front was something that they took seriously. And what they were trying to do at a time before the Catholic Church considered anti-Semitism to be a sin is they were trying to leverage Nazi-style anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic propaganda, and Catholic theology around violent resistance to tyranny to encourage Catholic followers of Charles Coghlan to take up arms against FDR, who was posited as a sort of biblical level tyrant. And it was incredibly radical and incredibly far-reaching.
Jesus Christ, the Fash cannot original.
It's just, there's nothing else like that today, and I don't know there ever will be.
I mean, I completely agree with that. And I think what's interesting about Coghlan as well is he wasn't just a radio host. He had a newspaper, social justice was distributed all over the country. I mean, in some ways, he was one of the first people to realize the power of combining media formats into a kind of multimedia empire, effectively, to involve both publications and radio. And I've always thought, what would Father Coghlan have been like on social media? How would we have used these platforms had he lived in a different time in ways that would be deeply uncomfortable, I think, to most Americans?
It's interesting, too, the gatekeeping role of the Catholic Church there, too, right? When we think about what stops movements like this, what stops demagogues, what interferes with the kind of reach and radicalism that we're describing, I think inarguably the Catholic Church deciding that Father Coghlan would no longer make broadcasts like this was just like a steel door coming down on him as a political figure. And there are very few circumstances in which something something that's so much a gatekeeping role like that can be employed against somebody who's doing that kind of damage in an anti-democratic way. He's just a really singular character, I think.
I agree. And the Catholic Church just kind of, as you say, slams the door shut. The hierarchy says you're no longer making radio broadcasts, and he's not, because that's the nature of the church hierarchy. Mm-hmm. One figure that I think is closely
extremely funny because the church actually banded together with the Nazis. Like, it was the church and the government getting together is what created the National Socialist machine. And, they just turned their back when all the atrocities were happening. And once more, the same thing is happening. Although it's funny because the MAGA crazy cult Christian nationalists love attacking the Catholics. And honestly, as far as I'm concerned, go ahead and let them duke it out, because both those establishments can go fuck themselves.
Related here, who himself kind of fulfills a gatekeeping role because of his immense wealth and his prominence in American society, is Henry Ford. And you talk about Henry Ford in your book, you know.
Yeah, Ford pisses me off too, Deidre. Especially with, I imagine all the things that they'll talk about in here with his radical anti-Semitism. And Mr. Ratchet, I stream whenever I find something that I feel like I need to make commentary about. When I see something that's relative or something that can help, I suppose, help get information out to our cause, to get people to understand the times that we're living in. I'm a veteran, and I took an oath to fight against enemies, foreign and domestic. And though I might not be boots on ground anymore, doesn't mean I can't do my part.
A lot of Americans, if they remember Henry Ford today, think about him as the inventor of the assembly line, which he is, the creator of a major motor vehicle company. What is Henry Ford's role in all this? I've always seen him as taking this sort of important, almost background role, but also in the 1920s playing a really key role in the spread of especially anti-Semitism in the US.
That's right. And, you know, I feel like my education on Henry Ford continues. I mean, I obviously thought that, full disclosure, I drive a Ford. but I think I knew of him as an anti-Semite, but I assumed it was like a personal vice. I assumed that it was his personal prejudice. I didn't know it was an animating force in his life. I think I even knew that there were questions about Ford's sympathies, or at least softness toward Nazi Germany, and I assumed that had something to do with him, wanting to keep the Ford plant open in Cologne, that the Nazis were using to build vehicles for their land invasion of Czechoslovakia. Like, I assumed it was a sort of a business interest cravenness there. What I didn't realize is that Henry Ford was, I think, inarguably the greatest anti-Semitic propagandist in the English language in the history of the world. I mean, his Dearborn Independent, which he bought in the 1920s, became a nationwide fire hose of the most potent, most dangerous anti-Semitic propaganda the world has ever known. He serialized the entirety of this famous hoax called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. He republished essays based.
If you're not familiar with that, not only is it false propaganda out of Russian, just straight up anti-Semitic propaganda, but also it's been re-fucking packaged and called QAnon. Just add, JFK Jr. coming back from the dead. But yeah, all the same principles, naming all the people like the Bilderbergs and the Rothschilds, saying that they control everything, etc., etc., because the Fash Cant original and QAnon is nothing more than Trailer Park Scientology.
On the protocols in a 4-volume book set, which was published in, I think it was a dozen different languages in a dozen different countries. The German language version of that had gone through multiple printings by the time Hitler became chancellor in Germany. Chancellor Hitler name-checked Henry Ford in the first edition of Mein Kampf as kind of his inspiration. He kept a large painting, a portrait of Henry Ford in his office. Ford was not just somebody whose private interests in anti-Semitism or toward Nazis.
That actually is a fact. When they interviewed Hitler, They asked, "Who's this man behind you?" And he said, "This is my biggest inspiration, Henry Ford." Once more, easily searchable. That is a fact.
The sympathy are of interest of him just in terms of his biography. He was a player. He was a man who made things happen. That the founder of the Hitler Youth credits Henry Ford's writings with making him anti-Semitic, with opening his eyes to the Jewish problem. That's a remarkable legacy. His legacy mattered in the United States, and it mattered well beyond our borders.
And it's really a shocking part of American history, I think, that this man who, again, this really man who helps invent the American automotive industry, one of the great industrialists of the 20th century without doubt, holds these views that, as you say, are not just private views, but they're views that really affect international politics in very profound ways.
Which he's trying to do. That's his aim.
Which he's trying to do.
And I mean, one of the things that you write about in Hitler's American Friends, and that I also talk to you about,
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. So, I agree, Gottfried. Is that why all the cops drive Fords? Because they are Nazis? Well, not only is that fucking hilarious, but like I said, really, what is the difference between an American police officer and the Schutzstaffel? Because, I mean, they were both allowed to just roll up and summarily execute you. Really, what is the difference? I mean, qualified immunity, aside from Colorado, what's the difference?
about for the podcast for Ultra was the Nazi propaganda scheme that was run through Congress, in which they took propaganda often written in Berlin, translated for an American audience, and they used various congressional offices to distribute that throughout the United States to propagandize the American people. One of the sort of sides.
Wait a minute. It's almost like getting Russian and Chinese spies to give you false information to try to impeach an American president. It almost seems like that. Does it seem like that to anybody else? I think it seems like that. Because, say it with me, gang, the Fashkant original.
Stories in that whole scandal was the way that Ford assigned Ford Motor Company personnel and resources to build out massive nationwide mailing lists to send all that stuff to. And, you know, it was a secret effort run out of Ford Motor Company offices, unmarked doors and the whole thing. Investigative journalists at the time sort of sussed it out and reverse engineered and figured out that they were doing that. But it wasn't just Ford personally.
That's genuinely why the Fash hates journalists. In some of the darker spaces that I've had to gather information from, journalists are the number one enemy. That they just can't stand them. They say it's because they report false news, but actually it's because they put sunlight on the plans of the Fash. And if there's one thing the Fash does, it thrives well in the dark, because the ideas aren't popular. And the moment that you expose those ideas, people catch on. It's like when you turn the lights on and cockroaches fucking scatter. And yeah, Derek, the police were created to enforce segregation. They're also created to catch slaves. There's a great documentary about the origins of the police being slave catchers that I'm going to have to do a reaction to. shoot me a message to remind me to do that one. Thank you. Or drop it in the link of one of my videos as a comment.
It was the resources of the Ford Motor Company, too, that were used to supercharge the Nazis' propaganda effort that targeted the American people.
Absolutely. So, yeah, this is not just a personal vendetta or a personal view that he holds. This is something that he absolutely puts his money where his mouth is, so to speak, in that sense.
Yeah.
You know, one thing that we want to talk about in this podcast series is not just the people who fell into fascism or the people who sympathize with it in the U.S., but also the heroes, really, in my mind, and I think your mind as well, who stood up against it. You mentioned journalists, and of course, journalists played an incredibly important role in exposing this, as you talk about in both Ultra and in Prequel. But one of the other heroes that I've always been fascinated by is John Rogge, who is this Department of Justice official. What have you found on John Rogge, and how do you feel about this, I think, really fascinating figure in American history, who again, I think deserves to be better known?
Rogge is one of the most complex, interesting, intriguing, impossible to know figures that I've ever spent significant time looking at. He was a sort of a wunderkind at the U.S. Justice Department. He became a very high-ranking Justice Department official at a very young age. He had all of these incredible notches in his belt. After Huey Long was assassinated in Louisiana in 1935, it was Rogge who was sent down to Louisiana by the Justice Department to bust up the Long corruption and graft machine, which everybody thought was absolutely impossible.
Huey Long was easily America's first fascist leader. He basically not only got a piece of a cut of everything in Louisiana. I mean, that's one of the reasons New Orleans is such a dirty town. But I mean, look at the beginning of that town, and it's always been dirty. But also, he created laws where the federal government could not go into Louisiana to enforce any kind of laws whatsoever. And he had basically an armed mob at his back. And when he was assassinated, people lost their ever-loving shit in the streets, like wailing and gnashing of teeth.
And Rogge, against death threats and intimidation and this incredibly wired system in Louisiana that was all stacked against the idea that anybody could come in from outside and bust it up. He absolutely busted it up and put everybody in jail. He was a national hero for doing that. He was involved in the Christian Front sedition trial in 1940, which was a spectacular failure. The New York Christian Front chapter that was put on trial for sedition, Rogge was brought in from Washington to be the sort of supervising prosecutor there, and it failed. He was then the prosecutor brought in to bring the Great Sedition Trial of 1944 to trial. That, of course, famously ended in a mistrial when the judge died in the middle of the trial. It's a crazy story. But
the judge died in the middle of the trial because there was just so much bullshit. They did literally everything that they possibly could to make the trial into a circus because, when the fash has to face accountability, they have to do anything that they can to ensure that doesn't happen, whether it's cheating or lying or in witness intimidation or just consistently yelling false objections. Yeah, the judge actually died from the stress of the case. Funny enough. Like I said, that happened in the Ultra podcast, which is well worth a listen.
in the end, what Rogge ends up contributing to our understanding is what he is able to assemble from the evidence that was put together for that trial, and what he was able to assemble after the war was over, after the judge had died, after that trial had essentially gone poof. Rogge went to Germany, and he was a native German speaker. His parents were German immigrants. He'd grown up speaking German at home. That proved to be very handy. He almost single-handedly went through tens of thousands of pages of German government files and was able to interview German war criminal defendants and basically put together documentation from the German side as to which Americans they were working with and who they were funding and what their aims were. And having that kind of, I mean, try to prove collusion. It's one thing to try to prove it from the American side. To be able to prove it from the foreign side, it's just amazing that he was able to do it. And he brought that evidence back to the United States and ran right into the buzzsaw of its political implications, because there were 24 members of Congress and U.S. senators who were named in his report, along with a bunch of very powerful business interests. And so Ragi's sort of post-war life ends up being this very interesting story of trying to get that information out there. Historians like yourself, people who are interested in this story like me, end up benefiting from that self-sacrificing work that he did. But it was really the end of his career as a public national figure.
Well, I think we might consider you a historian at this point, Rachel, at least in this stuff. I mean, you've done an incredible job, I think, bringing this story to life. And one thing that we're hoping to do in this podcast is kind of follow in your footsteps by bringing these people's voices back effectively. I thought you did a fantastic job in Ultra using archival audio. And I think I mentioned when I was on your show.
I think it's something that's absolutely amazing about the story of anti-fascist people back in the 30s, dating all the way to today, is nobody knows their names. They didn't do it for glory. They didn't do it because they wanted their names to be remembered forever. I mean, perhaps some of the law enforcement, they wanted to make a little notoriety because that's just kind of what they do. But people like Leonard Lewis, just nobodies who saw evil and was like, somebody has to do something. So I absolutely love that these names are coming back and finally getting the due that they've been owed, because fighting fascists is a thankless fucking job.
I'd never heard a lot of these people's voices before, and so we're hoping to do the same thing in this series. That's in our own way of trying to let these people be heard. I think one question that I get a lot is, why is this history not better known? Mm-hmm. Part of the reason that I started doing this research was that when I was teaching history classes, I couldn't find any of this stuff in the textbooks. Mm-hmm. And I was finding evidence about this in the archives. So why do you think this history wasn't better known prior to people like you and I and some others coming along and telling these stories?
I want to interview you on that same topic.
Well, let's do it. Let's do it.
Well, let me, I mean, before I give you sort of my take on it, I actually want, do you feel like you know? Do you feel like you have figured out why this history shrunk to such a tiny size among academic historians and in the popular memory? Do you have a thesis about it?
Yeah, well, I have a couple of thoughts. I think the first one is that I think this is deeply uncomfortable history. Yeah. I mean, this is not comfortable for people who, study American history, who have thought about American history in a lot of ways. It's like studying the history of other extremist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. It just doesn't really make you feel good. So I think that's maybe the more obvious answer. I think the less obvious one, though, comes out of late 1940s, early 1950s America, that we really go straight from the end of the war in 1945 into the Cold War. Mm-hmm. There's really no break there. And these groups, as controversial and as bad as they were in terms of committing subversion and undermining the war effort, mm-hmm. they weren't communists. And so when the shift immediately moves towards focusing on communist subversion, which it does almost immediately, I think it's very easy to kind of sweep these stories under the rug. And I think a corollary of that is that a lot of these people lived out their lives in the United States. These were people's next door neighbors. They were their friends. They were people who they knew from church or from social institutions or from country.
I'm not a communist by any means. But do you ever think that the Red Scare, the whole anti-communist thing that happened with not only Roy Cohn, who ended up being Trump's mentor, please look him up if you don't know who that is. That's the man who, when he met Trump, helped destroy America. I could do like a 3-part series on Roy Cohn, how much I hate him. But you ever think that perhaps all those people who supported the Fash before they went to World War II, when they came back, all of a sudden they saw the whole Red Scare as a way for them to go ahead and just get their Fash on again, but doing it with like patriotic drag? Just seems like that would make just a little too much sense to me. Yeah, I guess the fault lies with the people burning books now. Agreed.
Clubs or things like that. And so, this is kind of history that isn't great to talk about, I think, in the 1950s and 60s, and the government kind of loses interest in looking into it as well. That's my theory. What do you think?
No, I think that's very astute and very right. And I think that the idea that fascism is okay if you call it anti-communism is something that you have to just you have to be alert to that throughout American modern history, because that recurs over and over and over again. And I mean, I think that obviously looking back at the World War II era, it's not just that this is an uncomfortable topic. It's that the alternative to think about America as unified in our anti-fascist passions, and we all believed in the good war, and we all knew exactly what to do, and it was inevitable that we were going to confront Hitler and Mussolini. I mean, that just feels great. So it's not just that we don't want to opt to learn the uncomfortable thing. It's that the other option, it feels the sort of the reductive myth of an anti-fascist unified America in the lead up to World War II just feels too good to not keep going back to that. Academic history, I feel like, once this was sort of characterized decades ago as something that the government shouldn't have done, that the sedition trial shouldn't have been pursued, that John Raggi was over his skis when he was going after these guys. It just kind of stuck in academic history. In non-academic history, there is quite a bit written about this, and it's all written by neo-Nazis and fascists and people who are rooting for these guys. And guess what? Those folks aren't very influential in terms of making public-facing history or convincing academics to get involved. I did find in the archival research that I did on the sedition trial defendants, I did find myself in some pretty uncomfortable locations in terms of who was writing about these folks, who was collecting their papers, and who was making sure that the historical record includes their perspective on it. Fascists and neo-Nazis love this history because they think it was a high watermark for them. I agree it was a high watermark for them, but I love it for different reasons. I love it because of the people who were fighting against them.
Absolutely. Well, and I think you've hit on a really important point here, which is that the narratives we tell ourselves as Americans, there are deeply uncomfortable parts of American history, of course, but this is not one of those that has really been talked about all that much, as you say, in the mainstream of academia. But that, I think, is why the work that you're doing is so important, and that's what we're trying to do on this podcast as well, is bring back some of this history. Rachel, thank you so much for being on the inaugural episode of Star Spangled Fascism. I hope you'll listen to the series. I hope you'll enjoy it and enjoy hearing some of these historic figures, as troubling as they are, sort of speaking from the past. But thank you again for being here.
I'm so glad that you are doing this. I'm honored to be here on the inaugural episode. Godspeed, Bradley. This is going to be great. Congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The book is Prequel. Fantastic book. Available wherever books are sold. Congratulations again, Rachel, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Bradley.
Go to skipfranzjr.net for podcasts.
Record player that, I could just spin records all the time.
Run into the bathroom and I'm covered in blood. Like I had put my tooth through my bottom lip.
For music. For gaming and pro-liberty game rants. That's skipfranzjr.net.